Welcome to Launch Planning and Estimation Techniques. After watching this video, you will be able to define several key launch planning and estimation terms, explain the importance of velocity in launch planning and estimation, use a relative estimation analysis worksheet to aid launch planning, and calculate launch dates from your relative estimation analysis. Let's first review a few key definitions related to launch planning and estimation. Velocity is defined as a team's work capacity in a given sprint. It is measured in story points and will change over time. Factors such as the number of team members, their experience, and the maturity of the team's processes can all impact velocity. A story point measures the complexity required to implement a user story. Product owners base decisions on complexity and stakeholder agreement. Estimation in hours or days is often not practical. Story points allow a team to estimate the complexity of a user story compared to other user stories. Relative estimation is a method for evaluating story points for a group of user stories by comparing their complexity levels. Stories are analyzed and arranged in order of complexity. The Cohn method is a story point sequencing model developed by Mike Cohn that assigns values using a modified version of the Fibonacci sequence. Stories are assigned points based on complexity. Low complexity stories are given fewer story points than more complex stories. And finally, the Cohn method sequence is used to assign a story point score. The scale uses values of 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and 20 based on the assumption that levels of difficulty do not increase in a linear fashion. You should have already viewed the velocity planning reading, which included information on the importance of understanding velocity. Velocity is dependent upon solid story point estimation. Let's review why. First, it facilitates planning. Estimation helps create realistic and achievable sprint plans and release timelines. It enables effective prioritization. Estimation assists in prioritizing user stories based on effort and value. It facilitates effective resource allocation. Estimation aids in effective resource allocation and workload distribution among the team. It improves progress tracking. Estimation provides a metric to track progress and velocity over time. Finally, it improves stakeholder communication. Estimation enhances stakeholder communication by providing clear, quantifiable estimate. Next, let's review a relative estimation analysis worksheet. Let's assume a product owner and team have 8 user stories they need to estimate in a product backlog. These 8 user stories must be completed to release a new product. We begin by analyzing user story 1. Once we have completed our analysis, and let's assume it is of quite low complexity, we place it on the far left of the complexity analysis grid on the right. Next, we analyze user story 2. Let's assume this user story is less complex than user story 1. Therefore, we need to move user story 1 to the right and place user story 2 to the left of 1. Let's say user story 3 is about the same complexity as user story 2. In this case, we can place 3 under 2. We would then continue to analyze all the user stories and place them on the grid based on their relative complexity. Here is a completed analysis worksheet. Notice how all the user stories are lined up on the complexity analysis grid in terms of their complexity. We can now calculate the total number of story points for this 8-story product launch. There are 2 user stories in the low column. These stories are assigned 1 story point each. So, the total story points equals the number of stories, which is 2, multiplied by the assigned story points, which is 1, therefore the subtotal for this low column is 2. There are 2 stories in the low/moderate column. Using the Cohn model, these stories are assigned 2 story points each. Total story points equals the number of stories times the story points, so the subtotal for the low/moderate column is 4. There is only 1 user story in the moderate column, which is assigned 3 story points, so the subtotal for this column is 3. We have 2 user stories in the moderate/high column. These stories are assigned 5 story points each. Therefore, the subtotal of story points for the moderate/high column is 10. Finally, there is one user story in the high column, and this is assigned 8 story points, so the subtotal for this column is 8. We can now calculate the total story points required to launch this new product from all the column subtotals. As we can see, the total story points are 27 for this launch. Let's finish this video with some calculations. We know that product owners must provide value on time and within budget. One of the most common questions asked of a product owner by customers and stakeholders is, when can we launch? Let's use our 27 story point example. This release will require completing 27 story points of work. The time required to complete a story point varies depending on the complexity of the product. For a simple product, one story point may take a team 8 hours to complete. For a more technical product, one story point may take 25 hours of work to complete. A best practice in Agile is to begin by selecting and completing a 2-story user story. Research has found that this is the most accurate means of determining the time required to complete a launch. In this example, the team chose a 2-story point user story. They meticulously logged their time, and it took them 160 hours to complete the story. The next row in the calculation worksheet requires a simple equation. If 2 story points take 160 hours, then 27 story points will require 2,160 hours to complete for release. As you can see, the equation multiplies 27 story points by 160 hours and then divides by 2, giving us 2,160 hours. Next, we need to determine how many average hours can be devoted to each sprint. In this example, our team believes they can cumulatively devote 32 hours each day. Now, we can determine the total number of days needed to release the product. We know the total hours required are 2,160, and the team says it can work 32 hours each day. Therefore, the math tells us that a total of 67.5 days is needed to complete all the work. The final step is determining the number of sprints required to launch the product. This team uses a 15-day sprint cycle, so if we divide the total release days required, which is 67.5, by the sprint duration, which is 15, we see that 4.5 sprints are required. The product owner should round this figure up to 5 sprints and share the schedule with the stakeholders. Rounding it up provides a bit of a buffer should any delays occur. In this video, you learned that velocity is defined as the work capacity of a team in a given sprint. A story point is a measure of the complexity required to implement a user story. Velocity is dependent upon solid story point estimation. Relative estimation is a method that evaluates story points for a group of user stories by comparing levels of complexity. You analyze all your user stories and place them on the complexity analysis grid based on their relative complexity. And you use the release planning calculator to help you determine your product launch dates.